Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Actually, I've been waiting for this meeting for a long time. So happy that it is happening finally. Um, so this meeting basically to discuss how to integrate the Workload API, the new API that has been introduced um, for workload aware feature, and specifically the gang scheduler feature as well that has been introduced as an alpha in this release 1.35, and see how we can integrate it with the real or true controllers or workloads, which are like jobs, LWS, job sets, and other workloads as well. So I've been trying to gather all information and all. Yeah, just one second. Let me share my screen. So yeah, so I have actually tried to gather all the like the challenges, everything that we might think of related to this integration, and see how like what we would like to see or to approach this integration from all like all aspects. This doesn't mean that I'm going to like design or like be responsible for all these components. This is totally no, like it's like a big no. But basically it is like gathering all the problems in one place so we can understand what's going on and how we can like reach out a solution that can be generalized or like suitable or aligned with all APIs. Um, um, I expect that you already read this document, or at least, like went through it before the meeting. If not, uh, uh, it would be a little bit hard. I will try just to summarize everything. But otherwise, it's basically going through the key design document, the key design and the scopes for this, which is like how to define the workload controllers, and like making sure that it is working with like the workload API, and then the scope actually is like how to specify and mapping the true controllers APIs to the workload APIs and define some sort of some fields like the min count or minimum count and stuff like that. And then we went through like some detailed design, which is like how we provision the workload ownership model, and then like going through every single API and making sure that to list all the challenges. Um, First of all, any question related to this document? Would you like me to go through it, or um, discussing the like the challenges directly?
I think starting from challenges would be nice, because the document itself does not like start with that.
Yeah. So basically, the challenges it's like it varies from API to API, and this is why I couldn't list all of them like in the beginning, because the more you go through each one of these APIs, the more you will discover more challenges. But the big challenges that we have right now is how to enable the workload API and disable it, and how to configure it actually. What does this mean? So let's have an example here, the job API. So we would like a way to say, hey, for the parallelism, like or index job API, we would like to enable the workload API. and we would like to have the min count, like set as six, for example, six pods. How can we do this now? This is the big challenges for us right now. What we have so far is just the workload reference in the pod template, which is okay. This is good. We have the name and we have the pod group, but how can we create this automatically, or like how can we make the job controller create the workloads by itself? Kevin.
Yeah, I think the other challenge that, at least, so when I was looking at this from the job set perspective, you are correct that basically I want to disable the job controller from creating workloads, and then job set needs to kind of have more control over how the workloads get defined. The problem also I run into is like with topology aware scheduling and DRA in the workload API. I don't know if it really makes sense to kind of streamline the creation of these workloads, because like if somebody wants topology aware scheduling in the job controller, like it isn't as clear to me how to do that without just requiring, a manual creation of the workload, which I think it can be fine for a little bit, but part of what we want to do with job set was to kind of streamline a lot of the details for running a distributed job, like, a headless service and jobs and other things. And we kind of want to sort of hide, like, to me, a workload is kind of an implementation detail. And I don't expect, well, I would like to not have, like, I guess I was thinking when I designed job set, it'd be nice to have like pretty simple, like, I want all my job sets scheduled as a gang, like streamlining that one. But then if there are stuff like, oh, hey, I need all my job sets to share the same resource claim. I don't expect that to be the default for everybody. And I imagine that you would have to kind of control that behavior. And that's why I was like, with the API I kind of was thinking about for job set was exposing like a workload template and letting people kind of set those up as is.
Yeah.
And that's at least, sorry, that was where, yeah. And so for job, like disabling it, and then that's kind of where for job I'm not, I worry that putting the workload template in the job API does kind of break our V1 contract with the job. So I'm not as happy to add that API into the job spec, but for job set, I was thinking it could be a good way to iterate on this stuff now. Saw some hands up though.
Yeah.
Andre, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I just like want to maybe quickly ask, especially, from folks who, been responsible to implement this. So I remember like, a couple of months before we defined what is a workload. And I think I already asked this question before in the doc about, separating pod group to another API. So my question is like, in some sort of, more complex workloads like job sets or leader worker sets, when we require, complex orchestration, do we want to allow users to create more than one workload per job? Or like we want to represent, like the scheduling directives for the entire, resource that users are creating. So maybe, like if anyone has any, answers for this question, it would be nice for us to understand, how we should move forward to what kind of capabilities we want to, make in this workload API.
Yeah. So just following up on what Kevin and Andrea said, we ended up basically that we would like to just add the whole workload API field in each one of the APIs to be able to just configure it automatically, like without manually, like creating it, which is
Yeah, I think,
yeah,
yeah.
I don't like it. Like I feel like it's not sustainable, of course.
Yeah, because like my question is specifically, if speaking about, job sequencing, right? Or like, Argo workflow, right?
Mhm.
When the workload can be representing as a much more complex scheduling pattern or maybe optimization job, right?
Yeah,
Like, do we want to cover all this in a single workload API?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, please. I think Eric was next.
Not sure if am I next?
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead, Eric. I think I was next, but
Yeah,
Okay.
John.
probably
Okay.
responding to something more in the moment.
All right, I'll share how I imagined it would work. I'm sure there's things I overlooked, but just let me restate what I had in mind when I was writing the workload doc. I thought that controllers would typically not expose a workload template. As much as possible, they would try to use fields that make sense to their users, and so that different controllers would have different interfaces. If you really needed to override it, that was what the bring your own workload spec was, what I thought would be the mechanism rather than a workload template. I understand that for job set where it makes other workloads, that doesn't work. I thought there was like three cases the controllers would have to handle. One is what we'll call the legacy case, where you want some behavior that workload does not allow you to express, so you do not make a workload. So for example, if you want some kind of like elastic case that's just not supported by workload yet, then you don't make a workload and you don't get any benefits. Case two is where you you recognize that the thing the person is asking for can be supported by a workload, and you make that. And the third case is you let the user bring their own, and it's on to them to make it work. I thought the way that you would coordinate would be that if the pod spec mentions a workload, then it's assumed the user made it, and you wait until you see it. And if the pod spec in the template doesn't mention a workload, then you know that you have to make one. And that would cascade so that if job set wants to control the workload made by job, that it would fill that in and make it. I'm not sure how well that works. That's it.
Yeah. So I think I had similar comments. Like we do want. I also imagine the workloads, the workload APIs, the true workload APIs, right, are sort of they're purpose built for particular use cases, and they should expose an API that's appropriate for those use cases. And sometimes it might use the lower level workload API to implement some of the functionality like gang scheduling. And I think I still think in principle, that's the right thing to do. I do think you end up sometimes in a situation where like it's hard to maintain that abstraction and you want to leak details from the lower level thing. And so the override or indirection or adding the workload manually and being able to override that, I think kind of helps solve that. Where I think it's going to get harder is that the workload is, if there's a workload per workload, true workload controller, then that's fairly straightforward, but it's the pod groups. So if you have individual pod groups or pod group replicas, and it's a workload controller, true workload controller that's creating or instantiating new pod groups, is there a way to, how does the user override that when they sort of don't know the name of the group yet because it hasn't been instantiated yet? It's not clear to me how we, like the cardinality seems a little bit off, or we need some sort of way to attach pod group level policy to things that the true workload controller will create. We need a common pattern across these workloads, which I know exactly is exactly what the point of the document is. But so I think that's mostly what I wanted to say is like I think we need to really think about the pod group aspect, because ultimately there's one workload, unless we decide to change it, there's one workload object, but there may be many different policies depending on the specific pod groups.
Yeah, I guess from my like from the job set perspective, like I can create a workload and then like I'm allowed to say like, the leader and the worker are the same pod group, and then maybe there's a separate pod group in there, and that's inline in the workload API. I know there's some separate discussion about the pod group being its own thing, but at least from job set when I was playing around, like I have a design doc where I was kind of going through at least some of the use cases. A lot of what I needed from the job set perspective is handled with the workload API because I can always add new, like I can say like, replicated job 1 and 2 belong to different pod groups. So they are kind of scheduled separately. And that does allow us to support stuff like a leader worker where, maybe we want both scheduled together. It doesn't, and, there's always going to be subtleties. And I imagine for leader worker set, that might be a similar kind of pattern where maybe you want, actually, I don't know, but like I imagine that case, you might want the leader scheduled separately and then the workers are kind of, you might have like a minimum size for the workload. But either way, sorry.
Yeah, I guess your point is, and maybe I'm too worried. Like the 2 levels is enough because you already can specify a workload in a pod group. You can, whatever distinct pod group policies you have can be specified with distinct pod group name, templates or that's not what they are, but pod groups.
Yeah.
And then you reference them, and so the replicas they created, we're not going to mutate the policies on a per replica basis. The replicas are all identical from the pod group policy, so we should have enough expressiveness to express it. So.
Yeah, I think sorry, like to interrupt. I think disaggregated inference might be a challenging part, right? Because then we need subgroups. Because then you might need to schedule them as a gang. However, the resource claims might be different, right? And not attachments. I think we have this point as well in the doc.
Yeah. So basically, this is only one of the problems. Another problem is, like how to enable or disable this. We're thinking here. It's like the controller will just, like if it's automatically like that, the controller will just go ahead and create the workload API in that specific way, unless there is another workload has been defined for, like for the job. But it is it is it becomes really hard when we start to think about other APIs as well, like the Elastic job or the LWS, because you have to go through lots of details that I believe the user shouldn't go through it. For example, like how the pod group will look like in the LWS. So if we go down here, you will find that we went through lots of detail that the user shouldn't go through it. Like the user should know that the leader and, like this worker should be in one group and, like another pod group like that. It's a lot of details for a user that to just customize the workload API. And actually this just leads to a question. What is the need of exposing the pod group in general for the user? What is the need for that? It is just grouping a couple of pods, right? Grouping some pods together to be scheduled. But all the policies for the scheduling and other policies can be just in the workload API. We don't need to let the user worry about how the pod group would look like. So this is another challenge that I'm sharing with you. But Wojtek, please. Sorry, my screen has a problem, so I have only one screen, so I cannot see what is like the appropriate like hand raising. So please go ahead.
Yes, so I wanted to get back to like the questions and refer to. I think I generally like going back like few questions back. Like I think that I agree that like we should have like a one workload per user like oriented thing, user oriented workload. So like it for example like workload per job set or so and leader and pod groups are like the lower level hierarchy where we can distinguish the workloads and like have different like be able to express different requirements per different parts of the workload. maybe at some point we will need to go one level deeper, as it like was described in the like doc, that have like pod subgroups and so on. But I think in general, that's the structure how we were originally thinking about that. Regarding like John's comment about differentiating or like being able to differentiate different between different pod groups, I think that we may want to have like a template for the pod group itself. That's how I like what I expect like controllers or maybe users at some point to do. But like I don't think we really have a problem, or at least maybe I'm missing something. But I don't think we have a problem where like the differences between pod groups will like forbid us from like achieving what we need for with the pod groups level. So I'm not sure if it's like fully clear. And regarding like this question, like given that like you have that just asked, I think like the way I think about pod groups themselves and about workloads is that like in huge majority of changes, I don't expect users to actually interact it. It's like it's effectively an implementation detail how workload controllers are able to express their needs, their scheduling needs. So like in huge majority of cases, I don't expect like users to really even care about the existence of workload object or like pod groups themselves and so on. So it's like it's basically what Eric said at the beginning. We expect that like different true workloads like job, stateful sets, and so on will be expanded with like some new concepts that make sense for those kind of workloads, but the translation to the workload API and then like how it's then grouped, like what pod groups should exist and so on, it should be like an implementation detail that like users, unless they want to overwrite it, which like eventually I expect it to be like a niche use case. But other than that, like it should be basically an implementation detail.
And I think it is for gang scheduling. It gets really much more harder for TAS or DRA, which is where I think like the balance that I'm trying to figure out is, because like I imagine that a user submitting a job set will probably need to know whether or not they want DRA to share.
I
like
think
all the clients.
DRA for job set and pod group is moving slower than TAS. So I think we should leave that out of scope for this discussion.
But I think
TAS is going to be TAS has a good chance to be 136 if we align on all these issues. DRA above the pod level does not have a good chance of being in 136.
I think what we need to ensure is that we will not put ourselves into a corner. Yeah, sorry, Tim, given that you need to drop, like I think we should let you speak now. And
yeah, Hale, thanks. I started looking at all the docs, but there's a lot in those docs, so I'll have to read them async to this. I wanted to say, in scanning through them, I thought the case that Andre brought up with sort of feels to me like an interesting case in sort of the Chinese proverb sense. Do we accept that there is a need for a higher order group of groups concept that he's sort of describing there, with some caching, some prefill, some blah, N and M and Z indices that are all required together to operate the system? Or do we say, well, that's a higher order thing that a human has to be involved in? Because on the one hand, that feels like way too much to build in one step. One of the goals at the beginning of the whole workload API conversation was something that we can build in a reasonable amount of time that delivers real value. And so I don't want to zoom out too much, but I also don't want to build something that has a very limited lifespan if we think that the bigger sort of macro system is necessary. And then one last quick remark, in terms of the complexity of using these things, the users that I see, that I interact with who are needing these things are pretty sophisticated users. And so I think it's okay sometimes if the complexity is sort of proportional to the sophistication of the user. Not saying we should overcomplicate it for fun, but that sometimes things are complicated just inherently. That's all I'm gonna say. I'm gonna have to drop in just a minute. So if anybody wants to respond, I'll take it. Otherwise, I'll catch up with the notes.
I guess my concern is always like, let's say you use like an Argo workflow with a job set. It gets kind of difficult to kind of coordinate the creation of all these resources in the context of another controller if the manual step is like required to create a workload. So like that's why like I would like to try and for job set, I'd want the creation of those resources handled because there are some subtleties like for job set, like, you know, should we create a workload when it's suspended or not? And then if it gets, and like these are the things, they're subtle, but they do tend to matter in some cases. And it makes it kind of difficult, I think, for programmatically creating these resources with, you know, stuff like train job. But anyway, go on.
For Argo, so I think at this time and probably for the next year, workload is not going to be suitable for workloads that have greatly different footprints over time. And an Argo workflow is inherently something that like it's following a DAG. It has different footprints over time. So my recommendation be at this time, do not target Argo workloads to be a workload. Do it per job set. Job set is, we think modulo scaling is fairly like rectangular shaped in a time kind of like size versus time graph. If the size versus time graph is all over the place and it's not just like best effort scaling like LWS, we can't handle it. So I would say try to solve Argo workflows is too hard.
Yeah. And I think I agree with you. I'm not saying like what I'm saying is like if you had a DAG where the job set was there, but you're saying that a user creating an Argo workload has to create the workload for the job set to actually be scheduled, that makes it really hard to actually use like Argo workload with this, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about bring your own workload. The reason I introduced bring your own workload is I thought there'd be a time lag between the scheduler releasing stuff and then true controller teams like owners picking it up. And I wanted users to be able to move at the speed of scheduling team, not be constrained by slow maintainers. But I actually see great engagement from job set, LWS, train job. I'm actually less worried about that. And it's adding a ton of complexity. So I actually now think on balance, it'd be better if we defer and currently remove bring your own workload at this time because it's adding a lot of confusion and everyone who like people are well engaged. So that's a thought is we just drop bring your own workload and focus on stateful set, job set, LWS, train job, good support, and then push that forward and everything else can be ready when it's ready.
And how to configure the workload if we need to configure anything, how to customize it.
You just can't. If you wanted, like if the scheduler has like adds a feature and train job doesn't have it yet, you just have to wait for train job to release a new controller.
And what if the workload API? And what if the workload API added new field?
Wait,
we're waiting for all the jobs, the APIs.
You can see why I wanted. That is why I wanted to bring your own job. But the feedback in this meeting is that it's adding a lot. The possibility that someone might bring their own versus the controller owns it is adding complexity. If it simplifies it to say only controllers make them, that's an option.
And why not the other option, which is just making it user created instead of make the controller created or automatically created?
Existing workflows will not, existing users change their behavior slowly. People won't be able to get benefit without rewriting their config. That takes forever.
Yeah, I think that will, yes, I agree with Eric. Like, I think that we will not get any reasonable adoption in like a reasonable time frame.
How about making like the default workload API like every controller can just do like the base or the minimum workload API, but
I mean, you could have like an annotation that job set supports, like overrides, and then has a JSON path and a value, and like some hack that lets you inject values in the workload if that's really what we need. But
I'm not sure I hear bring your own workload is causing all that.
okay,
I mean, I'm not one implementing anything. So like, I'm just saying from what I hear, that wasn't what I was hearing, that was the concern. I mean, I don't see how you, my fear is that, right, it would push any changes that we make to workload would get kind of have to propagate and leak up to the higher level abstractions just because of one user, right? Like you whereas if you sort of keep those higher level APIs focused on the primary things that workload does, but allow an escape hatch, then you can, which the bring your own workload's kind of an escape hatch. So I don't know. I mean, are you saying that it brings too much complexity to bring your own workload, or is that just
it's
actually the other.
It's the sense I was getting from admittedly really quick skim of Heba's docs.
Yeah, so actually this should bring us to why should we make it automatically, because it's really customized, like across every single controller. We have to set together, making sure how the workload is behaving right now, what are the fields that they are exposing right now, and then implementing it. And this will happen, like on every single job or API. This is too much complexity. What I'm suggesting actually the other way, which is why not just like create it manually, make the user create it manually, as like the DRA, for example, right, the resource claim, for example, or like there are lots of other examples in Kubernetes that the user can create it. And I don't know if you have time to see my proposal for that, but we can make it very simple and remove a lot of complexity from the user. So it is really easy for the user to just create just another YAML file with like the scheduling policy, and that's it. I'm just saying that the complexity is getting really hard. Like I've spent more than a month going through all the APIs, and it is really hard. I cannot see it. I cannot see it evolving, to be honest.
I can't see adoption if users have to make a new resource. Like I look at how some of our customers use job set, and they have actually built their own complex scheduler that makes job sets as the way that it actuates like the user writes a higher level description of an AI training goal, like train this thing until it converges, and then it makes job sets. So they have to go through and like rewrite all this code to now make another resource. I just know they won't do that soon.
How about having the default workload for every controller? So if there is no workload has been defined, we will just create this one in a namespace, on this namespace, or across a cluster, for example. So we are introducing it to the customer, but it's like like it's like sneak peek. It's like, hey,
It's
this
a controller that looks at the true workload and makes examines all its fields and makes a workload object from it.
Can you repeat it again? Sorry.
There's a lot of other hands up. I'll let other folks speak.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to me, just remember with job set, all a job set really is an index job with a headless service. But what we found was that most people don't know that that's what's required to run a distributed job, and it makes it, like people were not aware that you could use an index job and a headless service to have communication among all your pods. And I like the idea of what we did in job set of trying to hide those details, and like not as familiar with Slurm, but from what I understand, most like the HPC community, like gang scheduling is there kind of for free for most workloads. Like it isn't something that people are like, oh, hey, I need to set a flag and say I want my workloads to schedule all together. It's just there. But I do think with Kubernetes, we kind of run into this problem where we have the existing behavior and we can't really break it. So to me, like what I was, sorry, what I was leaning towards and why I kind of jumped on this for JobSet was because like for JobSet, we already have requirements for gang scheduling. Our options as a JobSet maintainer are either we support Volcano or the co-scheduling plugin. And when I saw this come up, I was like, it would be great to not have to require people to install the co-scheduling or Volcano and kind of support those because like gang or queue with gang scheduling. So these are things I wouldn't try to avoid as someone using JobSet. So like no matter what, like if I want gang scheduling in JobSet, I have to go through with something, and that's kind of what TrainJob already has support for pod groups and Volcano. And like as a workload developer, I think we kind of have to have a solution that sort of hides this complexity from the users because a lot of people seem to want it. I know that's at least where I was. That's why I was looking at this from the JobSet when it came out in 1.35 is because we already have a requirement for gang scheduling, and it's would be nice to have something sooner rather than later. I'll let other people go. I don't know who is next.
Ron?
Just want to say, I was leaning about bring your own for like complex scenario, especially if you are using inference and you're using multiple leader worker sets and you want to have one workload API and send it to all those leader worker sets. And if I cannot do it if it's only created by the controller itself, because it doesn't know that I need 4 other leader worker sets with different spec to create working inference. This was my point.
Sorry, just to clarify. Sorry, John. Just to clarify the concept. So we effectively have even higher workload than leader worker sets. So like your workload consists of like few leader worker sets, right? Do I understand correctly?
Yes, this is the scenario I'm talking about.
Okay, so it's even yet higher workload. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, we are missing the hierarchy, but yes, basically a higher workload.
So yeah, I was going to ask basically the same thing, but I would ask, is that something that I guess this would maybe be what you're trying to say? Like, could you model that with one workload and pod groups, or do you need multiple workloads for that collection based on where the different policies are set?
So you would have to have a different subgroups. So I would promise that the number of decoders would be promised and the number of prefill will be promised as well. Now we cannot really create it. So if you want to say that I want all those decoder and prefill to be aligned, and you have leader decoder and workers decoder, and then prefill leader and then prefill worker, in this scenario where I need to schedule all those together and have at least minimum of some degree at each level, it's not addressed in the current API. I saw some caps about it, but I didn't know what is the planning. So for now, I would have to have at least the way to bring my own workload API in order to work. So I don't want the controller promised me it's my way or no way in that sense.
I think that definitely makes. I think in this, like the point that I mentioned before about integrated serving, I would imagine. I mean, if you not talk about Argo or Flow, but talking about inference specifically, inference will require for us subgroup concepts, right? Because there will be different topology domains for different, prefill and decoder stages, which we have to support, right? So hopefully the subgroup will some sort of solve this problem for us.
Okay,
Eric, do you
Ramona?
have an answer to this?
I
Because
want
I have a little.
to respond directly to Ron, and I'll try to be quick. So I heard. So there's 2 questions: is workload expressive enough to handle something like pre-field decode. And like if we add subgroups, like yes, we can express all the different pod templates that exist. The question is, how do you reuse like a controller, higher level controller? How does it reuse a lower level controller? In this case, we'll call it the Ron job is reusing, leader worker set. Well, they have to, like, if leader worker set doesn't understand how Ron job wants to, model a workload, then he can't delegate actions to leader worker set. He needs to like fork the leader worker set code and then build it all into one thing that uses workload differently. So the problem is like understanding the intent of the single workload object by a subordinate controller. That seems to be actually the main problem.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah.
So basically, we work very hard to accomplish this because, as you say, each controller handles his own thing, and he does not any idea what's happening on the side of him. So it makes our life very difficult. So we are working on a different project that actually solved this, but I don't want to talk about this. But yeah, our higher level API talks more about how you handle this as a group, and we are moving it to the leader worker set on the lower level. And for now, we need to support like a Kai scheduler for this example, but I would appreciate if in the future with subgroups, we would support it as a part of the main upstream.
Dominic?
Okay, so I have probably a more generic question. So if I understand correctly, we are still discussing about workload API that have embedded pod groups. The question is whether separating pod groups and making them separate objects, possibly with having groups of pod groups in the future, does that solve those problems? Because the way I imagine it, pod groups are kind of a pod. So we have controllers which create pods, and in the same way, controllers could create pod groups just to specify, like in count or some other constraints. So technically, I'm not an expert here, unfortunately, but I can imagine that some controllers create some type of pods and another controllers create another type of pods. So with separation of workload and pod groups concepts, we could have different controllers creating different pod groups for their own pods.
I think what we've discussed so far there was still the pod group policy definitions being in the workload object, and the pod group resources are really the replicas. So they wouldn't. What it sounds like what you're suggesting is to take that even a step further, almost. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah. And can I add?
Yeah.
Can I add one more layer to this, which is why not having the pod group as a runtime object instead of just having another API and add like add whatever we would like in the workload, and the runtime, and like the pod group will be just to basically connect the true workload with the workload only during the runtime. Because again, we can define whatever we want in the workload, but instead of having one workload for the whole like LWS, for example, we can have a workload for the leader, another one for the worker. So and it will be really like a static, like the storage class, for example. So it will be just a static object creating whatever, or adding all the policies that we would like for our workload to be scheduled according to, and then just the controller, the true controller, can create the pod group similar to Dominic just said, by just like according to their to their, like need for this pod group to be like.
Sorry to jump, but I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying we wouldn't. Are you saying only the pod group would be the runtime object and workload
Yes.
would become like a static class object effectively?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm curious to hear what other people think about that. Just one of the reasons that I was sort of asking whether pod group should be a separate thing than workload was about lifecycle management, not about policy attachment. So like, I'm mostly thinking about like resource claim allocation and deallocation,
Yeah.
matching the lifecycle of workload, matching the lifecycle of pod group. So if we made workload class a separate thing, we would lose the lifecycle management of resource claims at the workload level. I don't know if we need that as much as we need it for pod group. So I'm curious to hear others' thoughts, but that's kind of my, like if we separate policy configuration from lifecycle management, like we may need both, I guess is kind of what I'm saying.
Are there any active hands or can I reply? Anyone been waiting to talk?
Go ahead, Eric.
So earlier was a comment. Okay, so to John's point, I think you also need lifecycle management at the workload, at the above pod group level, the group of pod groups level, which we're calling workload. There's actually, for not all, but a lot of use cases, the workload, the pod groupings and groups of groupings mirror hardware performance and failure domains. And there's life cycle. So like with TPUs, you have like the life cycle at a node, you have the life cycle at like a slice, you have the life cycle at a super slice. I think NVIDIA probably also has that, where there's sometimes when like you have a large scale training and like it's spanning multiple NVL72s, but maybe you have like some life cycle where you like restart just one NVL72 and then you do something with your network above there, and then the other parts wait, and you don't want to restart everything. So you need like for large scale training and maybe for large scale, really large scale inference, you need hierarchical life cycle in order to deal with more frequent failures. So I think you have to do both. And the hope was that like even for really large systems, like 3 levels, pod group, and workload would be enough. But I think the other option was to have like pod group could have arbitrarily deep nestings of pod groups and pod groups inside pod groups. It's really hard to reason about like arbitrary depth trees in something like a scheduler and make it be performant, which is why I steered away from that. And because it's tied to physical hardware, there is going to be a finite number of levels, right? You don't have like 10 levels of hardware hierarchy. So anyhow, that's a thought.
Well, as long as it is a tree, I think the more levels, maybe it's not that a big problem.
No, more levels is unbounded levels is really hard, I think, right? That's an opinion. I don't know.
Yeah, I think like my question was about the topology over scheduling and DRA. I think we mentioned about like we should focus on task first and then DRA second in terms of the time scale. So I guess like the question is like back to the subgroups, right? For especially for inference, like the use case we know right now. I'm curious because today. So first of all, let me ask you: the topology constrained API, could it work without DRA if we move it to 1 to 36? Because this was unclear to me because I thought the 2 caps are strongly related to each other.
Okay, so I make a distinction between using DRA to drive scheduling decisions and using DRA to do configuration. DRA is a great way to have a driver that looks at, so in use case 1, you use labels to decide where to place things, and then the DRA driver either says, yep, I know how to do that, and it actuates it, or hopefully infrequently it says, error, you picked labels that don't map to things I know how to configure. But that works fine. The other one was where you don't use labels and you use the resource claims as sort of a pseudo label. And that I don't think we're going to have
there's a lot of problems we have to solve to make that work, and
Yeah.
and we're closer with the label-based tasks. So Eric, the sort of way we were leaning was we may still use I still want to look at how we can lifecycle resource claims along with these different objects of like pod group workload, but like whether we use those to constrain the topology in the scheduling, we could do that later, or we can like they're kind of parallel tracks, and we think we can land the label one sooner, and we can continue evolving because we have to deal with like some scalability issues and reserve for like there's a bunch of things we have to deal with, and it'll
because I'm trying
I would just add one more thing to that, which is like we actually, as part of like the task cap, like we actually want to implement the tasks to be able to consume the DRA constraints. We just don't want to expose it to the users. So like the scheduler itself will be able to consume that and schedule based on that. We just all the life cycle issues and so on, those are like adding complexity on how to exactly expose it to the users, what should be the API, how to template it, and so on, like all those like replicate. So we want to postpone that, but the algorithm itself like will be compatible and will actually work with like DRA resources and so.
Yeah, because I'm trying to understand, do we want to expose this to the root workloads, right? Or how we call it, the higher level workload, the actual workloads. Because different workloads, as we mentioned, with the training workloads, inference workloads, data processing will require different, like directives. And if they don't have control to configure them, like how they will, use the array or tasks or other features, right? So this is unclear to me right now. Like, do we have any answer for,
Can you clarify? I think
yeah, because like, I mean, back to like original point, that probably we don't want to expose the entire workload template to the users, right? We want to get like provide them set of features like gang scheduling or maybe like topology awareness via the API, so those workloads will implement. So my question is, do we want to separate those two topics like from each other? Tasks from gang scheduling, and how do you want to expose this to the end users?
Are you going to reply to that? Or I think that the discussion we've been having is whether bring your own workload. That was that and so like you pre-create the workload object and you reference it from the pod template or whatever, and then you automatically know which configurations to pick up was the solution. And I think part of the discussion here was whether that, whether we always bring your own workload, never bring your own workload, or something in between. Is that's my understanding. So all of those configuration options and policies get attached to that pre-created workload object by the user, right? Or you bubble them up into the higher true workload APIs. Those are your only two options, really, right?
Regarding gang, like Kevin's comment that like all their systems already have gang scheduling as a default and we don't, like that is a good way to look at it. So like gang is mostly going to be on all the time, and then Taz is this thing that you maybe optionally configure.
But part of Heba's concern was if the gang doesn't match existing like numerical counts within the true workload controller, like the min gang size.
Right. So okay. So for scaling, there's like three modes I think that workload controllers should implement. Option one is like scaling mode, and there's something like this in Heba's doc. I'm not sure that's exactly what was intended, but like scaling mode off means like forbid the user to scale it. Scaling mode best effort means like don't change the workload, just make more pods than min count and hope that they succeed, and maybe back off if they don't work. And then the scaling mode, disruptive or whatever means you stop everything, or you make everything go, you delete all the pods, then you make a new workload, and then you create them again. And then you're guaranteed to have the size, but you might go pending for a long time. And then the fourth thing, someday maybe we'll have something like IPPR where like negotiates a transaction or something, but we're not there yet. But I think that workloads have to have like a want to scale need to have a scaling policy.
At least,
think
at
that-
least having,
yeah.
yeah, at least having the max number of, like the desired pods, the desired number of pods that we would like to achieve. But this is one again.
Even
but
if you say max, it's not like, I think is max. We don't know if it's like, it's either going to be best effort scaling, because I don't know if max is guaranteed, or it's going to be like disruptive scaling. Those are the only two options, and those are so different. That has to be surfaced through the workload controller.
Yeah. Yeah. How about having the main count equal 1 as a default, and this means that the gang scheduling is off. Like we don't have any gang scheduling. And instead of having all these mods, because as a user, I'm really worried. Like I'm worried from like how complex this will be, to the extent that like I don't understand how to use it. I will not use it. Okay. So let's try to make it a little bit easier for the user, if like in case that they wanted to customize their workload, because I can see lots of cases for that customization. As Andrea mentioned, this is one. I was working on like analyzing the Elastic job as well today, and they might need to customize the workload for this. The same thing, like it's a lot of cases. We can go through every one of the cases in the document, but yeah, let's try to make it easier a little bit. Again, back to John's point, which is how to turn on, turn off the job, like the gang scheduling. I would just like propose that again the main count can be 1, so the gang scheduling will be enabled all the time. Okay, so this will be like similar to the default behavior. Okay, but if the main count equal 1, the bot will just ignore the gang scheduling logic. Otherwise, we will just like consider the gang scheduling according to how many main bots or main count we have.
But who sets the min count there? If I want really gang scheduling, who sets that in that option?
This is the thing that we were discussing. We don't have any other way unless update, like creating this custom workload by yourself. Otherwise, the controller, the current behavior now is controller will just map the main count according to some specific configuration in this workload. So, for example, sometimes would be the parallelism with like multiply with the replica. Sometimes would be the replica according to each controller. Like this. It will be different. And actually, this is another thing that I'm a little bit, like not comfortable with, because the main count and every single controller means something else. It's not like general concept anymore. It makes something like different in each true controller. Dominic?
Yeah, so this is what I was also about to ask, because my understanding was that true workload configuration has a way to specify that we need min count that many pods, and that this is already there, and that will translate to the pod group configuration of gang scheduling, and this min count will be simply written down into pod group min count requirement. And I thought that we maintain the true workload configuration separate from those concepts that we are introducing. So if you want to use different schedulers which achieve the same thing in some different way, then that's why we need to have true controller configuration that translate to different languages. From what I hear is that we think about creating generic configuration concept that will be a part of true configuration. So for instance, I understand that true configuration use pod templates to be created. So maybe pod group templates could be a good another element, and that's why separation from workload API might be a good idea. I don't know. This is something that probably we may need.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't find a nice way to solve the elastic job integration problem without having the pod group template, because the elastic job, it's basically, here is the first batch, and this will be our minimum count, right? After that, the gang scheduling is from the gang scheduling perspective, it's done, right? Because we have for example, the 4 pods, and how about like the other pods that we need to schedule when we have a resource. So in this case, we need to either introduce a mode, a gang mode, like continue, or like it's like repetitive or something like that, or having a bot template, bot group template, which is, hey, this is your way. Go ahead and do it for all the bots.
Okay, probably it could work this way, but when we look into a scale-up case, and we need to, for instance, add more pods, then simply I think that the controller should simply create those pods, and once those pods are scheduled in a coherent way to the already scheduled ones, this is how we can achieve scaling without changing the mean count, because mean count matters only for initial scheduling or rescheduling if we introduce it in the future. But to scale up, we don't have to change mean count because the workload is already scheduled. The pod group is already scheduled. But the parameter which Eric was talking about, whether we want to add those new pods or reschedule the whole workload because we definitely want to scale it up. This parameter is not necessarily a part of workload definition. Maybe at some point it could, but at the beginning, I think the controller should decide whether it should turn down the workload and bring it up again with different parameters, or whether it just needs to add some pods. Maybe in the future it will look differently, but like for today.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for reminding us. Just time check. We are seven minutes over time. It's up to you to continue if you have time. Otherwise, I can schedule another one, and we can like start to discuss what is the next step. What's your recommendation? Would you like to continue for another 20 minutes, maybe?
I'm happy to stay on. I don't think we're going to solve it in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you for setting this up and framing it, Heba. I really appreciate that. We should recur. Would love to come to recurring meetings. Obviously, it needs to be pretty frequent as we're in the KEP approval phase so we can get unblocked. General observation is a lot of focus on scaling when just getting fixed size workloads working would be still a pretty big win. So that's something to think about, is can we like take a win with fixed size workloads and then kind of revisit then.
Yeah, I guess Elastic Job, I even struggle. I need to reach out to who was author of that one, because I don't exactly know. I don't know many batch workloads that are actually like that smart. Like I'm thinking back to like an MPI job. I can't imagine how well that would work if you change the ranks of most applications would just fail horribly. But I believe Elastic PyTorch is a popular kit use case, and probably Spark, but I'm not as experienced there. And I also don't even think they use a job controller. Maybe PyTorch does, but Spark doesn't.
Yeah. So I can schedule this to be on a weekly basis if this is okay with you on the same time at the same time maybe, or we can have another poll if this is okay. And I believe maybe the next step is thinking again about the workload API, seeing what is the like what we need to like update, or like what we need to see in the workload API that can tackle these challenges. And also we need to figure out if we are going with the like bring your own workload API only, or having it as like created by the true workload, or we will have the two modes as well. So I think this is like the like the next topic that we would like to discuss. And
Yeah.
maybe for the next meetings, we can just bring just one API, for example, instead of having all these, and trying to apply whatever we are trying to achieve on this API. And if like all works well, we can move to the second one, just to make sure that we are covering as much as we can from the challenges we have.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I'm just trying to wonder for 1.36, like, because what I was originally thinking was that job set, and I'm maybe volunteering leader worker set to kind of pilot this a little bit. Like with job set, like I would be open to like iterating this with like a feature gate, and that way, like we don't like, to me, like from job set perspective, I don't want the job controller creating workloads because I don't want two workloads in parallel. And I think as long as we don't put this in tree, that doesn't block us in the long run for job set. But if we try and push in tree, then we have to make sure there's an opt out. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't know, like the priority, if like we maybe try to focus on like leader worker set and job set and getting those use cases nailed down, and then we think about entry.
Job needs to support a mode where it does not make a workload, but it does like fill in but you can put, it understands in the pod template what spec dot workload ref value should be, and it's going to need to add a field where it can like add a sequential index in there corresponding to the job index. I think if it just does those two things, you'll be able to go really far with jobs. So as a job set controller, you'll say, do your job, don't make a workload, do use these fields in your pods, and this field is sequential. You can get a long ways with that. Maybe not everywhere, and maybe not these like work, job set of job sets type of use cases, but we can get a long ways with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we can talk about that. Yeah. Next week. I think for the KEV process, I don't know if it's or we'll talk about that next one, but maybe
And
for
for
the
one-
job aspect. But yeah, anyway.
But
Yeah,
I
I know
think
we'll yeah.
I
Sorry, just
think we
one.
need, yeah, sure. Okay, yeah.
For 1.36, the cap 4671 is the high priority, right? As we discussed. So we probably need to review this, for 1.36.
So one thing I would add, I would suggest to look into this proposal of changing the workload API. If we really want to do it, we should take a decision
Yes.
very soon.
Yeah, I think this is the first step that we should tackle. Agree on what we need to add, update, or do with the workload API, and then we can see how we can integrate it with the job set and the LWS as well, which are out of tree. But yeah, it's a like necessary to know the main API that we need to integrate our workload with. So I think there is a proposal open from Eric and Wojtek about the like how proposal for making the pod group as high or a separate API, and some other changes as well for the workload API. And actually, I have another proposal which is really different from this, and I know it's a little bit like it's a new concept, let's say that. So I would really appreciate if you can go through it and read it. I already added to the chat and added to the agenda as well. I think we have two proposals. We will try to consolidate them into one proposal or one CAP for handling all the workload APIs changes that we would like. And yeah, I believe next meeting we can discuss these changes and like these proposals and try to achieve at least like some agreement on how the workload API would look like. So this sounds like a good plan for next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I will send a recurring meeting at least for the next 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks, yeah. And then we can see if we can, if we wanted to extend it or not. And yeah, I will share in this the two proposals as well, and let's discuss them next time. Thank you all.
Thanks, Heba.
Thanks, Heba, for this so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ron.
Bye.
Thank you.